Howdy, all you delicious people. I am here today. It's kind of a fast food kind of day, bizarrely, for these reviews. I'm ultimately going in and reviewing The Founder today, and then ultimately I'm thinking about also reviewing The Clerks too, which is also kind of like a fast food kind of movie because it has movies in it. So I don't know why. Like justifiably, I just ultimately just decided just like, meh, let's otherwise review these movies and get them on out there. So let's ultimately talk about The Founder. I honestly, really and truly do love this movie. Just because recently I like the fact that it's basically just like a pioneer of fast food joints that ultimately changed the game for seemingly every fast food or just food in general kind of approach. I like the fact that it seems that ultimately we have Ray Kroc, who is Michael Keaton's character, that ultimately is going to eventually go and just by happenstance just be able to find these two guys named McDonald and ultimately just end up going like, God, I need to be a part of that. I need to eventually be uh I need to find out like their story. I need to find out everything about them. And so we have it where seemingly within this movie it all looks all good and innocent, but eventually we have it to where we find out what eventually Michael Keaton's character eventually does within this movie, and that is kind of sad. But when looking at it, it's a true story. It's what happens, and then when looking at it, it's somebody just outsmarting another. When you have it to where somebody just doesn't want to do a certain thing, then ultimately we have it to where ultimately we have Ray Kroc's character that comes in and just goes, "Well, I want to do it." So, anyways, sadly enough, so I really like the fact that it seems like we get a real period of time where ultimately it was very hard to be able to have fast food delivered or otherwise realistically like see the approach of just having it to where like different kinds of fast food during the time period before there was a drive-through before there was a actual window like approach to a place to a store and everything like that. So it's very interesting to find out that we had it to where McDonald's was really just a one store location, but then eventually they went out and set up franchises, eventually to have it to where ultimately led to more exciting adventures. We got to really hear the story of both brothers who had originally owned the original McDonald's and their story. We also got to realistically see how basically just really just pioneers of just otherwise just changing the game of fast food and ultimately um, just to make it a lot faster. Fast food wasn't exactly fast in that time period. Really, a lot of times people would have just rather gone to a restaurant and waited on their food because ultimately they would have waited about the exact same as a fast food restaurant. Ultimately, knowing full well that hearing this, that fast food was supposed to be meant to be fast, but and when looking at it, you were ultimately to have it where ultimately you would pay at a first window, and by the time that you get to the second window, your food would already be there and handed off to you. Where a lot of times it's you pay at the first window, and then you wait at the first window, you wait at the second window to ultimately eventually get your food. But like that ultimately is what it is, and plus when looking at it, I have no grievance for people at the fast food industry because when looking at it, I know it's a hard job. I know reasonably it's. I've never been in a fast food restaurant really legitimately, with the exclusion of working at a Subway. So what do I know? I worked at a Subway for a couple months, maybe or a month or whatever, and then eventually I was uh, let go from that job just because ultimately I didn't understand that job. I didn't understand I messed up, I don't know how many people's orders. And ultimately, it was getting to the point where I was like, yeah, that's because your menu is not simplified. And the order of which that they said that things were incorrect. I don't know how many times I would have to be asking for things that ultimately would be in a different place by the very next day. And but that was obviously my fault. Obviously. To ultimately just keep switching things around so often and so much to where it's supposed to have a certain order, but order be damned for the most of the point. But anyways, let's get to the point. Let's ultimately go into ultimately talking about this movie. Yeah, I thought this was so fascinating. I really enjoy this movie. You can check this movie out on Netflix right now. Reasonably, I think for a lot of people, they might not see this movie as exciting enough for them, or people might not see it as something that like they absolutely need to see. And so ultimately, I was like, "Meh." When looking at it, this movie is just a film where it is just an interesting film that yeah it's slow, but you know what, like I think it gets to some points and you get some fascinating stuff about a franchise that you are well aware of, which is McDonald's. So let's go into that double five to otherwise talk about The Founder, because I actually really just enjoy this movie. And like it's a simple movie, and when you go into it, it's just an enjoyable film just because it feels like okay man, uh like this thing that you're so well known of hearing all across the globe had struggles trying to get to where it was, and now it's become like a household name and stuff along those lines. So it's kind of interesting to see the journey of a company that is so well known had so many issues trying to get to where it was. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So again, this movie's on Netflix. If you haven't seen it, go and check it out. I actually really, I went back. I had watched this once, and I went back and rewatched it just for the sake of reviewing it because I ultimately wanted to re-review. I wanted to review this movie anyways. It was a movie that I was like, well, regardless, I want to review this movie because I enjoy it. So the beginning of the film, we ultimately have it to where Ray Kroc, who is ultimately played by Michael Keaton, ultimately is a struggling milkshake salesman. It seems that ultimately he is selling a milkshaker that ultimately shakes multiple milkshakes. And so ultimately we have it to where seemingly we have this guy struggling to sell this thing. It seems like he's going door to door to door to door via all these restaurants, and ultimately saying it's like, well, hey, like if you have more supply, then there'll be more demand for your milkshakes. Because when looking at it, we have it to where Ray Kroc ultimately is to sell you on the fact that a lot more people are going to buy milkshakes and stuff along those lines. Ba 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 ba. So we end up having it to where Ray ends up struggling to sell these milkshakes, and eventually we have it to where ultimately he's also struggling to get any number of food at any establishment because it seems that ultimately they mess up his order, he waits too long to get his order, or this and that. There's always some problem. And ultimately, like, they have it to where they have like little drive-in things where ultimately you drive in and ultimately you have a screen that ultimately tells you your order. Hey, blah blah blah. Ultimately, we have a person via roller skates bringing out your order, and ultimately, it brings it out in plates and stuff along those lines. There are very few establishments that do that now. Like I remember A&W's used to do those and stuff like that. Um, it's kind of like a kind of like a gone concept now, and I'm sure it's very much more gone considering how new normal and stuff like that, how we're just kind of really just going by as having just a delivery system or drive-through more than anything. So going into this, so we ultimately have it to where Kroc is ultimately going and seemingly getting an order that seems absurd to me, that ultimately they had made some mistake. It seems that the McDonald's brothers ultimately had ordered a lot of milkshakes, and ultimately we have it to where Ray is very confused by this order. He's very baffled because ultimately it's like nobody really orders any of these things, so he's just kind of baffled and confused by what's going on here. So we end up having it to where Ray personally goes to this establishment, and we ultimately have it to where Ray ends up going and picking up an order from this burger joint named McDonald's. So we end up having Ray ending up so baffled and or confused by his order because one, it comes like a minute like after like he had made the order, and he's like, okay, where do I eat it? Why isn't there plates and forks and stuff? And we end up having the guy behind the counter registering or just telling the man, it's like, well, like if anything, there's kind of like everything is kind of wrapped up in a paper bag, and everything is like wrapped up and whatever. So ultimately, you can just eat it at your leisure. So ultimately, Ray sees everything wrapped up in paper, and he's like, wow, this is just like the most weirdest looking approach to a McDonald's that I've ever seen in my life, or a restaurant place in my life. This is the fastest food that I've ever seen, and I'm so confused. So coincidentally, I honestly think that there's something goofy about this story where it's just Ray coincidentally meets the owner of McDonald's. I don't think that actually goes that way. I think ultimately probably Ray probably asked for the owner of McDonald's, and then ultimately we had it to where the owner ends up walking out to ultimately meet Ray. So we end up having it to where Mac ends up going out and talking to, which is kind of weird. Ultimately, did Ray Kroc steal the name Big Mac, or just ultimately just called it a Big Mac as a kind of a jab to the previous owners? I don't know. But anyways, so we end up having it to where Mac McDonald ends up going in and talking to Ray Kroc, and doesn't even know that he's the milkshake delivery person. And ultimately, Ray ends up giving him his card, and Mac's like, "Oh, hey, yeah, you're the milkshake guy." So we end up having it to where Ray ends up meeting Dick McDonald and Mac McDonald, and he's like, God, I gotta buy you guys dinner. I gotta find out your entire life story right here and now. Like, I absolutely need to. I need to know as much information as I can about your restaurant. Like, it's revolutionary. It's like pioneerish, and it's ultimately just the most different thing that I've ever seen through every other restaurant. So we end up having it to where Ray ends up taking Dick and Mac to dinner, and they end up telling their whole entire story. Well, mostly Mac is. Mac is ultimately telling the story where ultimately they had gone from ultimately going in a business of trying to sell like hot dogs. And then they otherwise decided to go in and try to do a movie theater of sorts. That didn't work out. So they ultimately had realized or rationalized that the biggest sellers of food that eventually they had been selling were drinks and hamburgers. And so otherwise they decided to go in and make a fast food joint. The only problem is that ultimately the fast food joint that they were personally going to try and transfer over to where they were going was too big, so they ended up having to cut the building in half. So they end up making a much shorter, a much smaller building, and so we end up having it to where it seems that ultimately we have it to where reasonably this building took a while to get everybody to understand what is going on. There's some people that ultimately wanted to have it be a drive-through, and it wasn't a drive-through. Some people were angry that they had to walk up to the openings of the building and ultimately order their meals and stuff along those lines. So people were confused at first, but then eventually, when we slowly but surely had certain people go in and start ordering a meal, they ended up finding out that eventually just business just kept on just coming, just because reasoning, I guess, word of mouth, that ultimately this food was really fast compared to everyone else. So recently they ended up trying to ultimately set up franchises for this McDonald's, but nothing really worked. A lot of times it would end up that reasonably every single time they tried to set up a franchise of sorts, we would end up finding out that reasonably that every single store would end up going into business for themselves, trying to sell whatever is popular via that part of town. Ultimately, selling biscuits, or ultimately selling corn cobs, or selling obscure food that ultimately didn't fit the McDonald's menu, because a lot of businesses were going into business for themselves. So we end up having it to where Ray goes, hey, you know what? You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to set up franchises for you people. I'm going to set up this franchise, and I am going to go and set these other buildings up. Do it in the exact way of which that you were setting things up. Because ultimately we had it toward Dick ultimately had built an entire building around specs to ultimately make it so that people could work the fastest, and I thought that was fascinating. Like, Dick ended up drawing an entire tennis court to ultimately figure out how exactly to make it to be the fastest cooking thing that they could possibly put together. And so we ultimately ended up having these McDonald's characters ending up trying, and these McDonald's brothers ending up having their restaurant completely and utter customized for whatever they wanted, whatever they needed to make the fastest food possible. So we end up having it to Ray ends up going and making his own store, and at first we end up having it to where Ray ends up going and finding some rich guys on a golf course to ultimately fund this whole endeavor. And we end up finding out that these guys on this golf course are really just in it to just try and make some scratch, to make some money. They don't care how legitimate these buildings will be, and they don't care how well they will do, as long as they just keep making money. So we end up having it to where Ray eventually goes from building to building to building. It seems like his building is quasi going well, but eventually he's starting to see all the other buildings just start to go to crap. So ultimately we have it to where Ray ends up starting to see all the other buildings have the wrong orders or menus or whatever. The ultimately add in biscuits, the ultimately add in lettuce on their burgers, the ultimately add different number of pickles on their burgers, and so on and so forth. And we have it to where Ray ultimately is upset by all this, and then he is ending up going to the original people on the golf course and ultimately saying like how their orders are out of order, how they basically have biscuits and lettuce and corn cobs and all these things that don't make sense for the McDonald's menu. So We end up having it to where reasonably Ray has to buy all of these guys out to otherwise cement that he is going to put the right building or the right person to the right building. We end up finding out that it seems that Ray had found people that ultimately are just so desperate to try to make a buck that ultimately we have to where a Jewish person is selling a Christian Bible to people. And we have it to where Ray ends up going like, why are you selling this Bible to people if you don't even believe in it? And he's like, well, I need to make money. And so that's where Ray comes up with the idea. It's like, well, hey, instead of having these rich fat cats who ultimately don't really care about the thing that they're uh, just making money off of as long as it makes money, how about instead we actually have somebody be a part of this store that ultimately desperately like wants everything to get right, wants everything to be like the McDonald's way because that is how it's going to work out. We ultimately have it to where Ray ends up going from city to city to city to eventually just talk to every single person that would best suit him to be able to put a McDonald's building into a place that ultimately is going to be the person that he handpicks to be the best person for this McDonald's building. And he goes on to town to town to town to do these quotes over and over, this speech over and over to everybody about like about basically asking, it's like, I want you, I want you, I want you, kind of like he's kissing babies and he's politicking his way through this entire town, basically in all desperation, asking for the right person to be the right guy for this job to put a McDonald's thing together, and so on and so forth. So we eventually have it to where it seems that these buildings are booming and they're going fantastic, but it seems that ultimately Ray is barely making ends meet on, and so ultimately he's just breaking even every single time, and we have it to where bills are eventually going to be piling up because we have it to where Ray ultimately had put collateral on his home, and he is not seeing a big return on this investment. Like, not big enough because ultimately he keeps pulling for more and more towns and stuff like that. But ultimately, when doing that, he is not making a big enough money. He's not making big enough money to justify the things that he loaned out to expand McDonald's. So we end up having it to where reasonably the bills are piling up. Eventually, Ray is ultimately going and demanding that Dick give him a higher percentage of pay. And we end up having it to where it's consistently that Ray and Dick ending up having these funny phone conversations where we end up having it to where ultimately someone is hanging up on somebody, and that's always how it ends. We end up having it to where Mac and Dick are having these arguments ultimately to have Dick ultimately mention it's like, dude, we let a rooster into the hen house. Like he's going to uh he's going to destroy us. It's just a matter of time. And we have it to where reasonably Mac is ultimately way too optimistic, and ultimately we don't know how conniving Ray is at this point. So until eventually we get to find out. So we eventually have it to where Ray is ultimately being like asked by certain towns, "Oh, could we please put a McDonald's in our town of Chicago and whatever in New York?" So we end up having it to where the towns are coming to Ray to ultimately demand they need a McDonald's there, ultimately suing and winning him over by ultimately having seemingly piano player ultimately uh, some piano player named Joan Smith ultimately winning Ray over by uh, by playing a little ditty on the piano, and we ultimately find out that it seems that Ray's father was a piano mover or something like that, and ultimately, like him playing a song with her on the piano, ultimately is winning him over, which is ultimately winning the businessmen over to try to get a McDonald's over where they want a McDonald's to be. So we end up having it to where reasonably now we are ending up going into having Ray just seeing how far beyond that ultimately he is having so many problems and the business is getting final bills and all these kinds of things. And so ultimately we have it to where it seems that Ray and his wife's marriage is going under Ethel. Ultimately we have it to where Ray and Ethel end up getting a divorce because ultimately we have it to where reasonably a lot of times Ray is talking that it seems like when he goes to other McDonald's and he sees that the husband is working in the kitchen, and we have it to where the wife is working and giving a ton of people out suckers and stuff like that for free. We ultimately have it to where Ray is talking about a team that ultimately uh, that a wife and a mother or a wife and a husband were working as a team at this McDonald's. And ultimately, when looking at Ray and Ethel's relationship, we have a lot of times where ultimately Ethel is ultimately trying to ultimately just kind of say that Ray is never really and truly home, to the point where ultimately when Ray talks about having a roof over his head, Ethel is like, "What roof? You don't live in this roof. Like, how often are you really actually even here?" So I think that is just to ultimately tell us where Ray's relationship is going to turn with Ethel. So we end up having it to a reasonably. So there's a problem. So we end up having it to where they find out the way to cut costs is to ultimately get rid of all of the ice cream that is to make milkshakes. And so we have it where ultimately it seems that Joan Smith's character ends up coming up with a compromise of doing a instant mix that ultimately tastes just like a milkshake, but the only difference is that you can just have a packet and pour it into water and then stir it enough, and then ultimately it'll taste just like a normal milkshake. And so we end up having it to where Ray sees this as a good idea and ultimately calls Dick about it. And Dick is like, "No, like we need real actual milk. Like we need a real actual ice cream. And like we're not going to budge about that." Well, we have it to where reasonably after this disagreement, Ray is just like, "You know what? Like these people are just so stubborn, and like ultimately I'm tired of arguing with them, so I'm not going to argue with them anymore. I am just going to basically buy them out." So we end up having it to where Ray ends up going to a lawyer, goes to a banker to try to figure out how to save some kind of money somewhere, or try to be able to bargain with these bankers to hold off on like taking his house basically. And we have a Harry S. Sonborn or Sonborn who ultimately comes in and ultimately says, like, "You know what? Like, you don't actually need to buy another building. What you only need to do is just buy the land that that building is on. Have somebody from um, have somebody from that part of town ultimately own that building, but you own them." And so, because ultimately you own the land. So ultimately we have it to where all of a sudden Ray figures this out and otherwise starts setting up franchises seemingly everywhere. And we have it to where ultimately now we have McDonald's calling themselves McDonald's Corporation, and ultimately we have it to where ultimately Dick calls Ray and is like, "Hey, why are you setting up this corporation?" It's like, ultimately, uh, that's wrong. That's putting our name and ultimately, uh, like doing something wrong with it and without our say. And we have it to where Ray is ultimately saying like, well, that business is just inside of this business. Like, but that business has absolutely nothing to do with Dick or Mac. Like that McDonald's Incorporation, it has their name on it, but when looking at it, it's not about them. Like it's really just about the company in general, but it has nothing to actually do with their company. So it's kind of interesting. It's kind of an interesting legal thing to go about doing. So we end up having it to where eventually that Ray ends up going and sending all the instant mix to every single one of the McDonald's with the exclusion of Dick and Mac, and ultimately they end up calling and saying like, "Hey, why did you order all of these instant mixes to every other of these stores besides us?" And Ray goes, "You know what? Like, if you guys don't want to make money, that's fine, but ultimately I'm going to make money, and this is the way to cut cost." And so ultimately we have it to where we really see the wheels turning, where basically Ray is ultimately telling Dick and Mac, it's like, well, I have so many buildings, I have so many things that slap the word McDonald's on it that aren't actually yours at this point now, that reasonably we have it to where eventually Ray is eventually going and saying like, well, we have it to where Mac is mentioning to Dick at some point in this movie that the McDonald's that ultimately Ray has is called McDonald's Number One. Ultimately, as a D move, and so ultimately we have it to where Ray eventually goes and basically says it's like, well, I've pretty much mastered this company all over the globe now, or all over the country now. And so recently I have amassed so much money that I'm basically just going to buy you guys out. Buy um, buy out the way that they basically did things, buy out their name, buy out everything. And that ends up giving it to where ultimately Mac ends up having a seemingly heart attack. And so we end up having it to where Ray comes and sees them and ultimately just gives them a blank check to ultimately just say, hey, whatever will get you to go away, like, here you go. Uh, we end up having it to where Dick ultimately tells Ray it's kind of an underhanded thing that you did, and it's like, why go this far and buy the word McDonald's from us? Why buy this restaurant? You could have gone and done any number of other things. And we end up having Ray mention it's like, well, there's so many of these stores that have some kind of gimmick, there's some kind of approach, but if anything, the difference between them and yours, it's like I couldn't go and call my restaurants or my fast food joints Crocs. It wouldn't have worked. Ultimately, a name like McDonald's ultimately sounds wholesome and sounds family friendly and everything like that. So ultimately, why not go and have to create something when there was something already here, right here in front of me, that I could have taken and eventually just uh, made my own kind of thing. Ultimately, throwing shade to the whole McDonald's family of just going like, well, F you, like, I'm going to take your name and I'm going to just make it my company, make it mine now. We end up having it to a reasonably, yeah. So Ray ends up marrying Joan Smith, and ultimately we have it to where seemingly Ray is eventually doing an award thing that ultimately he's having to have to do a big speech, ultimately talking about his victories and what he had won and so on and so forth. Yeah, so we eventually kind of tail end that movie of this, where ultimately we have it to where Ray kind of stepped on some people to get his way through this, but when looking at it, he succeeded nonetheless. So I thought that this story was really interesting, but then it's also like, man, that is so sad that basically Ray went from right under these guys and stole everything from under them, and these guys that have had worked out this successful thing that ultimately they can no longer use, because ultimately we have it to where reasonably, if these guys were to go after being bought out, they couldn't go and try to make the same burgers again. They couldn't ultimately call themselves their restaurant McDonald's and all number of things. And so we end up having it to where these guys ended up just going like, well, I guess we're just done. Like, I guess we'll just take our money and walk, because that's all we can really do. So it's like the guys who really just had like the whole science broken down and really just the masterful approach of this whole thing ended up just getting swindled and taken over by Ray Kroc, who ultimately ended up just taking this thing and making it a worldwide success. And so, yeah, that is an interesting story. It's sad, but when looking at it, I just enjoyed the just underhandingly journey of all of this. Just going like, wow, like, I guess it's just the thing of like when you have the approach of where Ray goes into just saying it's like, well, I was willing to basically step on anybody's neck to be able to get this company and to get it to work. And so now that I have, you're the neck that I'm going to step on to ultimately get my way to having this restaurant, this success, and so on and so forth. And Mac and Dick weren't going to take that step. So, I don't know, I thought that this movie was so interesting. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was fascinating. Just the science of it all and just the overall the approach of really just the like, oh my god, he's really just going and taking this entire company and stealing it from them. And I was just godsmacked. And I was like, wow. So ultimately, the original, like, it's kind of like any other, like, kind of approach of probably a comic book thing where ultimately you'd have, like, the original creator doesn't draw it anymore. And then eventually we have it to where there's one key solo person that ultimately has the rights to any number of certain comic book entities and stuff like that eventually that can keep going on and doing them, but eventually they have to pay the last of kin of whoever originally had done it. And so ultimately, yeah, fascinating nonetheless. I wonder if ultimately they had to keep getting numerous paychecks to ultimately pay those guys off, or if it was a one-time thing. Like, you would have thought that eventually they would have probably gone and asked for a severance kind of thing or something like that, to where it's ultimately they would get every year they'd be like, well, like, I want like kind of paid things for every single year of ultimately like this company's still alive and whatever. But I guess when looking at it, probably during that time period, there wasn't any of that kind of stuff going on. Or ultimately, you'd have it to where ultimately, like, well, I want the idea and this and that, and like, but yeah, like, so, I don't know. When looking at it, interesting movie. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.